Okay, let's dive into this explainer and explore how a single tragic video game character acts as a gateway to some truly profound existential philosophy. Now, when we think of the video game Dark Souls, what usually comes to mind? Brutal difficulty, right? Frustrating boss fights, maybe a broken controller or two. But beneath all those punishing mechanics lies a rich and honestly terrifying narrative that deeply mirrors real-world philosophy. Today, we're going to map out how the game's lore, specifically the horrifying story of one seemingly minor character, literally forces players to confront heavy ideas from existential thinkers like Nietzsche and Camus.
We're going to start our journey hidden away beneath Firelink Shrine, where we meet a character named Anastacia of Astora. From your very first interaction with her, there's just this immediate, overwhelming sense of guilt radiating from her. As she greets the player, she issues this deeply unsettling apology about her impure tongue. She spends the entire game confined in a tiny, dingy stone chamber beneath the game's central hub, and despite being so quiet, she forms one of the absolute most important emotional anchors of the entire game. But it really makes you wonder, why on earth is she apologizing for her tongue?
Well, the crucial, horrifying point here is that she was physically mutilated to prevent her from ever speaking a god's name in vain again. Anastacia is mute because her tongue was forcibly removed. According to the game's deep lore, this wasn't an accident. It was a highly specific punishment tied to what she herself calls that impure tongue. Long before you, the player, even arrive in this bleak game world, she was subjected to this horrific ordeal and locked away in a cell, tasked with a sacred duty despite her utter mutilation.
So, Part 1, the Silent Fire Keeper, trapped by duty and lore. To truly wrap our heads around her situation, we have to look at the massive disconnect between her mechanical purpose in the game and the horrific reality of her lore. On one hand, she's super helpful, right? She upgrades your Estus flasks, which are your vital healing potions, and she keeps the Firelink Shrine bonfire lit, giving you a warm, safe haven. But on the other hand, the lore reveals her true, agonizing state. The item descriptions in the game tell us that a Firekeeper is a corporeal manifestation of the bonfire, and her soul is literally gnawed by infinite humanity, writhing and squirming just beneath a thin layer of her skin. It is total nightmare fuel.
Her tragedy isn't just emotional, it's intensely, intensely physical. We already know about the tongue and the writhing humanity tearing at her soul, but if you read the description of her clothing, the dingy set you can find in her cell, it mentions that the bloodstained skirt suggests its wearer was maimed in the legs to prevent escape. I mean, think about that. She is disabled, mutilated, and internally tormented, all just to serve as a convenient little checkpoint for the player.
Moving on to Part 2, Tragedy and Betrayal. The murder of a Firekeeper. Because just as you start relying on her, the game violently rips her away from you.
You spend hours venturing out into this incredibly hostile world, constantly returning to Anastacia's bonfire for safety, for healing, just to catch your breath. She becomes a total fixture of your survival. And then, the game completely subverts that comfort. Once you ring the bells of awakening, a character named Knight Lautrec just up and murders Anastacia. Your safe haven? Extinguished. You find her dead body, her bloodied clothes, and an item called a Black Eye Orb. And now you have to embark on a quest for vengeance. You use this orb later on to invade Lautrec's world, kill him, and reclaim Anastacia's specific Firekeeper soul so you can finally bring it back to her cell and resurrect her.
But here is the real gut punch. What's truly tragic is that even in resurrection, her suffering doesn't end. You fought this grueling, epic battle to save her, probably expecting a hero's welcome, but instead, she simply uses her newly restored voice to beg you to leave her alone. She's still deeply, fundamentally ashamed of her impure status. You haven't actually freed her. You've just forcefully reset her back to her horrific status quo, just so you can continue using her bonfire.
Which brings us to Part 3, the existential nightmare. This is where game mechanics cross the line and become philosophy.
You see, Anastacia's endless bondage actually perfectly mirrors the player's own journey. Her forced, repeating cycle of suffering isn't just, background flavor text. It is the thematic core of the entire game. And this is exactly where real-world existentialism comes into play. Enter Friedrich Nietzsche and his famous philosophical concept of eternal recurrence. Imagine if, when you died, you just woke up and had to do the exact same things over and over again for eternity. Nietzsche used this as a thought experiment. Would this eternal loop absolutely crush you with despair, or could you somehow find a way to love that fate and live it to the fullest?
Well, the game literalizes Nietzsche's theory.
In the lore, humans are branded with the dark sign, which means they cannot truly die. They just resurrect at a bonfire, slowly losing their minds over time until they eventually go hollow. And this perfectly maps to the players sitting on their couch. Every time you fail, you see those big red words, "You died." You respawn, and you have to run through the exact same enemies all over again. The game is literally forcing you to personally experience Nietzsche's eternal recurrence.
Adding a whole new layer to this nightmare, we have Albert Camus's philosophy of the absurd. It perfectly describes humanity's desperate search for purpose in this bleak cycle. Camus pointed out the painful, glaring contradiction between our deep human need for meaning and the cold, silent, fundamentally meaningless universe we actually live in. In Dark Souls, you are repeatedly told you're the chosen undead, meant to fulfill this grand, glorious prophecy. But the deeper you dig into the lore, the more you realize this prophecy might just be a manipulated lie cooked up by dying gods just to maintain their own power.
Camus famously used the ancient Greek myth of Sisyphus, a man cursed by the gods to push a massive boulder up a mountain for all eternity, only to watch it roll right back down, as the ultimate metaphor for the absurd. But Camus concludes that Sisyphus must be happy, because the struggle itself is enough to fill a human heart. When you spend 3 hours fighting the exact same Dark Souls boss, dying over and over, wanting to throw your controller across the room in pure gamer frustration, you are Sisyphus. The frustration is the point. Overcoming that anger and conquering that obstacle becomes your only true meaning.
So Part 4, Becoming the Ubermensch, Rebelling Against the Cycle.
How do we, and our character, actually break free from the god's oppressive cycle of fire? If the game world is an endless, absurd loop of suffering, what is the proper philosophical response? Well, jumping to the third game of the series, Prince Lautrec acts as our absurdist rebel. He simply refuses to participate in the cycle. He recognizes that linking the fire, sacrificing yourself just to keep the old god's age going, is a curse. He represents that very first spark of rebellion, the realization that, hey, you don't actually have to play by the rules handed down to you by authority.
This brings us right back to Nietzsche and his concept of the Ubermensch, or the Overman. Transcending the cycle requires a few key philosophical steps. First, you have to overcome your own limitations by actually mastering the game. Second, you must abandon the hope for an easy escape, which is represented in the lore by characters like Slave Knight Gale, who violently try to just paint a brand new, escapist world. Third, you must reject the manipulative piety of the gods. And finally, you have to embrace amor fati, which translates to the love of your fate. You have to accept the brutal reality of the world and master it anyway. So, at the very end of the world, your final decision isn't just picking a game ending. It is a profound existential choice. If you choose to link the flame, you are making a nihilistic choice. You're blindly accepting the meaningless cycle of suffering just to keep the status quo going, pretty much exactly like Anastacia being trapped in her cell to keep her bonfire lit. But if you choose to walk away, you rebel. You let the flame die, ushering in the Age of Dark, which represents mankind finally taking control of its own terrifying, uncertain destiny. Ultimately, this whole explainer isn't really just about video game lore. It's a challenge. It's a challenge to reflect on how you face the endless struggles of your own reality. The horrific imprisonment of Anastacia and the punishing, brutal mechanics of the game are just tools to make you feel the heavy weight of eternity and the absurd. When you face repetitive frustrations in your own life, do you just blindly link the flame and perpetuate the cycle? Or do you take ownership of the struggle, love your fate, and forge your own meaning? It's a fascinating question to chew on. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next explainer.